Good morning, everybody. My name is Connor Flanagan. I'm the Director of Education over at the Southampton History Museum. And this morning we are joined by Martin Levinson. He's a teacher at Stony Brook University, and he also gives lectures at various different libraries and other historical institutions in the area. So we're very happy to have him here today. Today's talk, the 6 strangest presidential elections so far, definitely pretty apropos for this year. So without any further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Martin. If anybody has any questions, please submit them in the Q&A or the chat functions in Zoom, and I'll come back in at the end and I'll ask all your questions to Martin. So enjoy, everybody.
Oh, hi. Thanks, guys. Martin Levinson here. I do history lectures at different libraries. So today we have an interesting topic, the 6 strangest presidential elections so far. And obviously I was referring to the so far part. That's the last election. But had I to do this this lecture over again, that lecture would have been in the 6 strangest presidential elections. So just to let you know. Anyway, I'm going to give you, before I do the different presidential elections, I'm going to give you some background. If you'd like to ask questions, I guess I'll leave time at the end, although I'm hesitant to also do it in between. Maybe we could, if you want to, I'm not sure which would be better. Maybe if you want to ask a question during the lecture, maybe that'd be okay too. But if you want to save it for the end, that's cool too. Okay, so anyway, the 6 strange presidential elections, you should see it. I'm doing a PowerPoint, and you can see that there. So George Washington was elected by acclamation when he ran for president. There were no political parties at the time, and everyone knew he was going to win.
Martin,
yes.
Sorry to interrupt you. Could you
okay.
Can you point the camera down a little bit more, because it's cutting off half your head? There you go.
Good?
Perfect. Yeah, that's great. Thank you.
You're welcome. George Washington was elected by acclamation when he ran for president. There were no political parties at the time, and everyone knew he was going to win. None of the founders had predicted political parties, but laughably, they were the ones who formed the parties. Before Washington left office, he spoke about the dangers of having political parties. Then there were parties, the Democratic Republican Party and the Federalist Party. In the 1790s, the British and French were at war, and the Democratic Republicans favored the French, while the Federalists favored the British. So the parties, not unlike today, were at war with each other. In 5 presidential elections, the presidency has been awarded to the candidate with a smaller popular vote than his or her opponent, due primarily to the institution of the Electoral College, which was set up because America's founding fathers did not think the people would always make good decisions in presidential elections. So the founding fathers basically didn't trust the people, and you can argue whether that was right or wrong. There's a lot of people today say we should get rid of the Electoral College. I happen to be one of them, but you can argue either way. That probably won't happen. So let's get to the first election, the election of 1800. You see the 2 folks who ran against each other. It's John Adams versus Thomas Jefferson. You probably know who won that election, and it wasn't Adams, who, by the way, was probably the most intellectual of all of our presidents. So electoral politics got serious in 1800. Political parties were in full swing by this time, and they battled over high-stake issues like taxes, states' rights, and foreign policy alignments. Thomas Jefferson ran as the Democratic Republican candidate, and that has nothing to do with the parties today, the Democrats or Republicans. But that was the name of the party he ran on, Democratic-Republican, and John Adams ran as a Federalist. The election campaign of 1800 was a partial replay of the campaign of 1796, with the Jeffersonians opposing Federalist policies. The campaign, which was largely fought in the nation's partisan press, got really nasty. Republican newspaper editor James Callender notoriously accused Adams, and listen to this, of having a hideous hermaphroditical character, because a hermaphrodite is you don't know man or woman, but that's a pretty good slander. While a Federalist writer named Burleigh claimed that if Jefferson won, murder, robbery, rape, adultery, and incest will openly be taught and practiced. That's about as bad mudslinging as you hear today. By mid-December 1800, it was clear Jefferson and his running mate Aaron Burr had beaten out the Federalist ticket of Adams and Charles Cotesworth Pinckney. Alexander Hamilton was in large part responsible for that result because during the campaign he called Adams mad and egotistical. But there was a problem. At least one Republican elector had been expected to withhold his vote from Burr to allow Jefferson to come out ahead. But none of them did, and each man received exactly 73 electoral votes. So I should preface, back then you didn't vote for a, president and vice president as one vote. Everyone ran separately. So theoretically, the second person who got the most votes would be the vice, could be the president, could be the vice president. But anyway, what happened there is when Jefferson ran, he ran with Burr, and the idea was one of the people who were going to be voting in the election was not going to vote for Burr. But he decided to vote for Burr, so now he had a problem where the two of them now were tied. Adams was below Burr, so he wasn't even in the race. All right, so now who's going to be president? So by mid-December 1800, it was clear Jefferson and his running mate, Adam Burr, had beaten out the ticket. So I mentioned that, but there was a problem. So the federal electors, so each guy got 73 votes. The tie sent the election to the lame duck House of Representatives, where Federalists nominated. Don't forget, Federalists were Adams folks. Though public opinion favored Jefferson, many Federalists decided to throw their support to Burr. Don't forget, Burr was the guy that killed Alexander Hamilton, if you've seen the show, and you knew that anyway, hoping to keep Jefferson from the nation's highest office. Burr refused to confirm that he would turn down the presidency if the House voted in his favor, leading some people to conclude that he was secretly angling for the job. Alexander Hamilton was one of those people. Though he disagreed with Jefferson on nearly every political issue, he thought Burr had few principles beyond his own ambition. In a fierce letter-writing campaign that would continue from mid-December to late January 1801, Hamilton worked hard to convince his fellow Federalists of that fact. There is no doubt but that upon every virtuous and prudent calculation, Jefferson is to be preferred, he wrote Oliver Wolcott Jr. He is by far not so dangerous a man, and he has pretensions to character. But unfortunately, Hamilton didn't influence the Federalists all that much because he had vicious attacks on Adams, who was a Federalist, as well as scandal in his personal life. He was having an affair. By the time the House began voting on February 11, 1801, Hamilton's concerns about Burr had failed to sway many members of his party. So the Constitution mandated that each state's delegation in the House vote as a single block to decide the election. This put a great deal of power in the hands of one man, Delaware Federalist James A. Bayard, who was the lone representative of his state in 1800. If Bayard changed his vote, his state changed its vote. In the first ballot and the 34 that followed over the next 5 days, Bayard cast Delaware's vote for Burr. With no clear winner emerging, the nation hovered on the brink of chaos. Republican newspapers fanned the flames by suggesting possible military intervention, and groups of unofficial Republican and Federalist militia began to drill in preparation for a potential civil war. So we think, about the Civil War today. So they were really preparing for one back then. Meanwhile, Bayard, possibly due to the influence of Hamilton, who had written to him on January 16th, arguing that Burr was a man of extreme and irregular ambition, was reconsidering his position. According to historian Ron Chernow, and Chernow wrote the biography of Hamilton, Bayard suggested in a caucus that he might vote for Jefferson to prevent a constitutional crisis after other Federalists shouted him down with cries of "deserter." Bayard met with two of Jefferson's friends, John Nicholas of Virginia and Samuel Smith of Maryland. He sought to confirm that as president, Jefferson would leave certain Federalist policies, including Hamilton's financial system and office holders, in place. After getting tacit assurance that Jefferson was in agreement with these terms, Bayard submitted a blank ballot during the 36th round of voting on February 7, 1801. Federalists also stepped aside in Vermont and Maryland, allowing these state delegations to vote for Jefferson and sealing his victory just 2 weeks before Inauguration Day. So we're looking at what happened in the election now with Trump saying, it's not real, it was fraud, it was rigged. Back then, there'll be other elections that'll be more interesting than this one, but this was a close one. So anyway, the point being that it was such a close one and there was so much going on that they passed the 12th Amendment eventually, saying that it was going to be, when you voted, we did amended the election of president and vice president. So today, when you vote for president and vice president, you're voting for a twofer. You're not voting separately, and that was a good thing. So that was the election of 1800. And there's the electoral map. There weren't that many states in the Union. And there's Burr and Hamilton, of course, with guns. You know, Hamilton killed, Burr killed Hamilton. So now we're going to go to the next election, the election of 1824. And that election was strange from the get-go. If only for the fact the Federalist Party at that point was on the cusp of extinction. And all four of these candidates were Democratic Republicans. Again, remember that the Democrats and Republicans, it's not like today. It's just a different party. So you have four guys running, they're all from the same party. Who were these guys? It was Henry Clay, William Crawford, John Quincy Adams, and Andrew Jackson. And each represented a different geographic part of the country. And of course, each of the newspapers back then supported the candidates. And the newspapers were like social media today. You know, they were full of invective and very partisan. So newspapers, they made fun of how Adams dressed and his, in quotes, English wife. They called, by the way, this is John Quincy Adams, who was the son of John Adams. John Quincy Adams was also the Secretary of State of James Monroe. You know, the Monroe Doctrine? That really was the doctrine that John Quincy Adams put together. They called Henry Clay a drunkard and a gambler. They charged that Crawford had done unlawful acts while in office and accused Andrew Jackson of murder. So Andrew Jackson, who actually was President Trump's favorite president, Andrew Jackson was a war hero and statesman. He won the popular vote by fewer than 39,000 ballots and took 99 electoral college votes. Secretary of State John Quincy Adams had 84 electoral college votes, Crawford had 41, and Clay had 37. So with no candidate earning the majority of the votes, the House again had to settle the deadlock, and Jackson was confident that he would win the presidency, given that he had won the popular vote and the electoral college vote. But the House had to choose among only three candidates, so Clay got the boot. So the way they chose was each state had one vote, and only the top three vote recipients participated. So Clay, who came in fourth, couldn't compete. Clay believed that Adams was the best qualified for president. He did not think that Jackson's success as a general meant he was ready for the presidency, and so he supported Adams. You know, Jackson had great success as a general in the War of 1812 when he fought the Battle of New Orleans, and that battle was fought after the war was over, really. But Jackson didn't know, and neither did the British general, so that battle really shouldn't have been fought. But Jackson won the battle, and because of his great victory there, he became a popular person in the country, so he could run for president, just like Eisenhower ran because Eisenhower led D-Day in World War II. Country seems to like military leaders. Teddy Roosevelt also went to the Spanish-American War, so he became popular. So the way to sometimes go in, and Kennedy with World War II. So the way for many of these folks to become popular with the public is to be a war hero, if you can do it. So anyway, so the election went on. And what happened is Adams won, and he chose Clay as Secretary of State. So that seemed like, you know, Clay gives you the votes, and then you choose him as Secretary of State. They called that the corrupt bargain because it looked like, you know, a deal was made. And I know it's never been proven that the deal has been made, but arguably it doesn't look good. So it looks to me like the deal has been made, and I'm not the only one. So anyway, he won the election, Adams did, and even though it was a tough election, Adams was accused of pimping out an American girl to a Russian czar. Adams said Jackson was a barbarian who could not write a sentence of grammar and hardly could spell his name. Jackson's wife, Rachel, was called a convicted adulteress because she had years earlier married Jackson before finalizing her divorce to her previous husband. Rachel died after Jackson won the election, but before his inauguration. At her funeral, Jackson blamed his opponent's bigamy accusation, saying, "May God Almighty forgive her murderers, as I know she forgave them, but I know I won't." So he held grudges, as well he should. Anyway, in the following year, or the following presidential cycle in 1828, Jackson indeed won the election. He beat Adams, and that was that. So that was a pretty interesting election, not your normal election, okay? So let's go to the next one. That's the electoral map of 1824. You can see all the states. There's poor Rachel Jackson, the scandalous divorce. The reason that scandalous divorcee is because she had thought she had divorced her prior husband before marrying Jackson, but apparently the paperwork hadn't gone through. So technically she was a bigamist. And so they made a big deal of it, but they really shouldn't have. And she took it to heart, and really to heart. She had a heart attack. So there's the next election, the election of 1876. The two major party candidates were both experienced and dull. There was Rutherford B. Hayes. He had been a general during the Civil War and a general who saw action. He was a pretty good general. And there on the other side is Samuel B. Tilden. He had been a district attorney fighting corruption in New York, where he was governor. So that was the Democrats and Republicans. Now, you know, the Republican Party was started by Lincoln. The Jackson, you could argue, is the founder of the Democratic Party. So the South, basically, they were all Democrats back then. And the Republicans were the liberal party, unlike today. So the Republicans were the ones in the North. They were the ones that came up with the different amendments, freeing slaves and having Black people vote. So basically, they were winning most of the elections back then. It's usually the Republican, not the Democrat, because there are more Republicans in the country and more Republican electoral votes. So Hayes is the Republican, and Tilden, even though he's from New York, he's the Democrat, okay? So, but in the election, guess what happened? Tilden got 250,000 more popular votes than Hayes, and he had 19 more votes in the Electoral College, so it looked like that was it. The problem was with the Electoral College, he actually was one vote away from 185 votes. He only had 184. But here's the deal. 4 states composing a total of 20 votes, Florida, Louisiana, South Carolina, and Oregon, were disputing the results. Kind of sounds like today in a way, although today they really aren't disputing the results. Trump is trying to get people to dispute the results, but that's not the case, at least not in the courts. So in any event, the Republicans charged the Democrats had intimidated Black voters in the states of Florida, Louisiana, and South Carolina, which is probably true. The whites in the South, even today somewhat, were really intimidating the Blacks. And in Oregon, one of Hayes' electors was ruled ineligible because he was a federal office holder. So you had a conundrum. What are you going to do? 2 guys, you don't have an electoral college majority. Goes back to the Congress. And what did Congress do? They didn't know what to do. They formed a 15-person committee to settle the result. And here's how the committee was, here's the members of the committee. 5 members were to be selected from each house of Congress. They would be joined by 5 members of the Supreme Court. That would yield 7 Democrats, 7 Republicans, and 1 independent, okay? So the independent was a Supreme Court justice known as David Davis, who was said by one historian, no one, perhaps not even Davis himself, knew which presidential candidate he preferred. So he was genuinely an independent candidate. So just as the Electoral Commission bill was passed in Congress, the legislature of Illinois elected Davis to the Senate. So they did that because Democrats in the Illinois legislature believed that they had purchased Davis's vote by voting for him. They figured we'll put him in the Senate. He'll be grateful for us. He'll vote for the Democratic candidate. But guess what? He decided to resign his seat on the Supreme Court and go into the Senate, which means he was ineligible to vote. So now they'd have to pick from the remaining 4 justices who were around. And sadly for the Democrats, the 4 who were around were Republicans. So they had to pick one. He voted for Hayes, and Hayes won. So the Democrats were furious because Tilden legitimately won the popular vote. He had the electoral vote, and they felt the election was being stolen. But they worked a deal with the Republicans, and this was the deal. So this is an important election. The deal was that the Democrats would agree that Rutherford Hayes could be president, but they said to the Republicans, you got to pull all the federal troops out of the South, because during Reconstruction, the federal troops were in the South, and they were there to make sure the whites didn't basically, do bad things to the Blacks, like lynch them and beat them and make sure they couldn't vote. And it worked. After the Civil War, 96% of Mississippi Blacks would vote. When Reconstruction was over, only 6% of Blacks would vote. So you could see the whites were really intimidating. In any event, they made that deal, this is an important election because this was the end of Reconstruction. Had Reconstruction lasted, you would have had a different South. But once the troops were pulled out, the South shall rise again. And indeed they did. Many people argue the South won the Civil War in a sense. I mean, they were defeated militarily, but the outcome was, they were in charge of their own destiny. And for many, many years, ran the states the way they wanted to. So Tilden lost, and basically said he could retire knowing that he had but well, I won't give you the quote. But anyway, I just want to let you know that that election yielded the highest voter turnout of eligible voting population in American history. 81.8% voted in that election. As Donald Trump would say, huge. That's the electoral map of 1876. That's the end of Reconstruction. That's the end of the slaves. So now we go to the election of 1888, and it was the third of 5 US presidential elections, and the second within 12 years in which the winner did not receive a plurality of the national popular vote. Benjamin Harrison, who won the election, lost the popular vote by 100,000 votes. So those were the two candidates. It was Grover Cleveland, the Democrat, and Benjamin Harrison, the Republican. Harrison had a very cold personality. He was called the human iceberg. But he was a good guy other than the fact that he had a cold personality. He could never have run today, because today you've got to be entertaining on TV to win. Or at least not that's either entertaining or telegenic. So Grover Cleveland also was not that telegenic. He was the Democrat. Grover Cleveland was an interesting guy, one of my favorite presidents. He was a hard worker. He worked 16-hour days and would come home and say, well, that's another half day's work. He also was an interesting guy because he married, when he became, right before he became president, he married a woman 24 years younger than him. He'd always been a bachelor. And they had a bunch of children, so that was popular. Cleveland was also an interesting guy in that during the election, they accused that he had a child out of wedlock. And unlike denying it, and the woman that he was accused of apparently had relations with other men, not just Cleveland. But he took responsibility. He said, you know what? I'll take responsibility for the child, and I admit I did it. And it worked with the public. They didn't blame him. He actually won the election. So during this election, that Cleveland was running in 1888, and by the way, Cleveland was the incumbent, so he had won in 1884, so he was running again in 1888. So this was the election, and the Civil War veterans loved Harrison, who had been a general. Now, Cleveland didn't serve in the Civil War. Unlike in Vietnam, where people were running away and deserting, Cleveland bought his way out. Back then, you could hire a substitute to be a soldier for you for $300. So for $300, he bought a substitute, and that didn't. So the veterans didn't think he was such a good guy. He got out of the war. Also, Benjamin Harrison had great name recognition. His grandfather, William Henry Harrison, was a great general, and William Henry Harrison actually was president for a month, but he had a sad passing. He gave an inaugural speech, caught a cold, and died a month later of pneumonia. So the lesson there is, don't speak so long, and wear a coat when you're speaking, if you're speaking outside. So anyway, so that was that election. And so Grover, in any event, as I said, the Civil War veterans loved Harrison. Grover Cleveland wasn't a big fan. Tariff policy was a big issue in the election. Cleveland had proposed a dramatic reduction in tariffs, which was probably a good idea. Harrison took the side of the industrialists and factory workers who wanted to keep the tariffs high. It's like today, probably, factory workers here want high tariffs because then goods here are less expensive. So that's why Trump actually put on tariffs. Cleveland also opposed Civil War pensions. That wasn't never a good idea to do something like that, et cetera. In any event, Cleveland actually lost that election, but here's the interesting thing. Cleveland ran again after he lost because, back then you could have as many terms as you wanted. The fact that people only ran for 2 terms was because Washington had only had 2 terms. Washington was so popular, he could have ran for the rest of his life and won. But after 2 terms, he stepped down. So it was like, not a law, but a tradition, you serve for 2 terms. So, presidents did that up until, Teddy Roosevelt ran for a 3rd term, but lost. But FDR had 4 terms. So after that, they passed an amendment. You can only have 2. But in any event, Grover Cleveland, as I say, ran again in 1892 and won. So he's the only president who won an election, lost an election, won an election. Sometimes they call him, I forget the number, but he's like president, 32 and 34, which is kind of strange. But anyway, he did. And his wife was kind of interesting. So when they lost the election, she said to the people in charge of the White House, the furniture and stuff, he said, don't move the furniture, we'll be back. And she was right. So, good for her. Just to mention the campaigning in that election, which was kind of interesting. So in this particular election, there was something called the Murchison letter. And the Murchison letter, we talked about the Russia and the Trump and all that kind of stuff. But here was something that worked beforehand. So in the Murchison letter, a Californian Republican wrote a letter to the British ambassador under the assumed name of Charles Murchison. It wasn't his real name. And he described himself as a former Englishman who was now in California. And he asked, who did the English think was the better person for president? And so the ambassador wrote back, well, we think Cleveland would be better. So they published that letter. And so a lot of the Irish voters in the United States said, oh, the British won Cleveland, we'll vote for Harrison. So there's dirty tricks right off the bat. And it worked. It was a good move. And also, there was another thing going on. By the way, back then there was not a private, today we have a secret ballot. And people think that was the way it was from the beginning, but it wasn't. In most of the 19th century, it was a public ballot. You would go to town square, you would cast your vote, but you do it publicly. I mean, anybody could look at how you were voting. So they bought votes back then, and people who bought votes were called floaters. You give a guy a couple bucks, you tell him, vote for this one, vote for that one, and you could see how he voted. It wasn't like today, you give him a few votes, who knows how your person's voting. No, they could see how he voted. And so it looked like they say Cleveland was, paying off these floaters who did exist and who would sell their vote for $2. So, and because of that, and because of the impropriety of it, in that election, they finally got a nationwide movement to replace ballots printed and distributed by the parties, by the way. So back in the 19th century, it wasn't like, today where the ballots were by, electoral commissions. Back then, the Democrats had a ballot, the Republicans had a ballot. They gave you the ballot. So even you could see when you were doing the voting, you could stand by where the voting was happening and see which ballot the person had. So when you were buying votes back then, you really were buying votes and knowing they were bought. So that was gone. And of course, the secret ballot is probably a good thing, but there are arguments for a public ballot. They're not so good. I have a nephew who's a professor of Brandeis, who's an expert on this. He wrote a good op-ed on the Times about the secret in the public ballot. Okay, so anyway, so that's that election. And now we'll go to the election that's the map of 1888. There's the Murchison letter I told you about. And now we go to election 1912, an interesting election. You see the candidates there. Woodrow Wilson, who obviously won. Teddy Roosevelt, who from history. Taft lost. And Eugene Debs, who ran 4 times for president, always losing. Debs was interesting. In 1920, when he ran for president, he was in jail because he spoke out against World War I and was thrown in jail by a terrible law that Wilson allowed to go through, called the sedition law. And Debs said, if I win, I'm going to pardon myself, but I'm not sure that would be right. Trump may try to pardon himself. We'll see what happens. So in any event, Woodrow Wilson is running against these three Republicans, and it's almost guaranteed, not 3 Republicans, 2 Republicans, and Debs. And because the Republicans were split, Wilson was going to win the election. Now, why were they split? Well, Teddy Roosevelt was everyone loved Teddy, and he had run for president after McKinley, who Roosevelt was McKinley's vice president. McKinley was shot and assassinated. Roosevelt became president. He ran again. He won by overwhelming numbers. And then he decided, he only said he would serve. He wouldn't run after that, which was a mistake because he could have kept running. But his vice president was William Howard Taft. You see that Taft is there. So he said, at least I'll have someone who'll do my policies. Even if I won't run, Taft will be my man. So Taft became president because everyone voted for Taft because they liked Teddy. Taft was a big guy, 312 pounds. There's a story that he was in the White House taking a bath one day and they couldn't get him out of the bathtub. They had 4 guys to get him out. So in any event, so there's Taft. So Roosevelt was looking to see how Taft was doing. Roosevelt was running around Europe and he didn't think Taft was a really good president. So when they came back, he thought, you know what? Even though Taft is going to run against Wilson, I'm going to go I'll go into the Republican primary and see if I can run instead of Taft. And actually, the Republicans were smart. They would have picked Roosevelt in the primary. And the primaries then were basically not like today with caucuses and each state voting. Basically, they were picked by insiders, the candidates who would run. But they picked Taft. I guess the Republicans felt he was his turn, he should run. And Roosevelt said, oh, yeah, you picked Taft, I'm running on my own party. So he did run in his own party, the Bull Moose Party. Why was it called the Bull Moose Party? Because Roosevelt said, I'm as strong as a bull moose. And he was. Actually, he gave a speech in Wisconsin during the campaign, and he was shot. Some guy shot him in the chest. The bullet was slowed down by an eyeglass case and his speech in his pocket. And he knew he was smart enough to know that the bullet didn't penetrate the lung, but he was bleeding. In his white shirt, you see the blood, spilling over the shirt. And he said, ladies and gentlemen, to the crowd, I don't know if you know it, but I've been shot, but I'm going to be delivering my speech. And for 84 minutes, he delivered a speech. Well, I don't know about you, but I'd be heading for the hospital. But not Teddy. He gave that speech, and then he went to the hospital. And actually, after he was shot, Wilson and Taft and Deb stopped campaigning. But Roosevelt was a dynamic campaigner, really an amazing guy, just full of energy. Actually, I heard once that I'm not sure if this is true, but he drank a gallon of coffee a day, but he just had tremendous energy, nonstop, go, 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 go kind of guy. But in any event, Wilson, of course, was well, not of course, he was a Princeton professor, did his best. And please, Kathy, come back. And that was just great. Oh, okay, could you hold on one second? I just need to talk to someone. I beg you, please take me, I beg. Okay, I'm back. Okay, so that was that. And so that was that. He was the first, so Wilson won. He was the first president, Democrat, to win since 1892, and would be one of just two Democratic presidents to serve between the American Civil War and Taft carried only Vermont and Utah, taking 8 electoral votes. Wilson won 41.8% of the national popular vote, while Roosevelt won 27%. Taft won 23% and Deb 6%. This was the first election with a former president running for a third term. So it was a really interesting election. And now so there's the electoral map. There's Roosevelt and Taft. There's Woodrow Wilson. And now we go to the election of 1948. This is an election which those are the candidates, Dewey and Truman and Thurman and Wallace. Those are the Democrats. Truman had been president, and he was FDR's vice president, so he had been president, and he was popular when he was in office, but then he was unpopular. The Democrats were unpopular. They voted out the Democrats in Congress, and it looked like Truman was going to be a long shot in that election, a really long shot. Don't forget, he's running with 2 other Democrats, the progressive Henry Wallace and the conservative Strom Thurmond from the South, and he's running against 1 Republican. So you figure, like Wilson, 1 against 3 or 2, he's going to win. But Truman's pulled one of the greatest upsets in his history of the presidency, and he actually won the election. He did so because he worked like a crazy person, ran around the country, did whistle-stop tours. Just was an amazing victory. And no one could imagine it. I mean, they said Dewey, who was the governor of New York, said, don't say anything controversial. So we said things like, the future is ahead of us. I mean, things that are just like silly, stupid. But anyway, Truman had a feisty campaign style, and he energized his base of traditional Democrats, consisting mostly of the white South, as well as Catholic and Jewish voters. He also fared surprisingly well with Midwestern farmers. Given Truman's sinking popularity and the seemingly fatal 3-way split in the Democratic Party, Dewey appeared unbeatable, but he wasn't. He was beaten, and it was give him hell, Harry. That's what they would say. And that's a popular thing you may know. On his desk, he had "Don't pass the buck," and he was just did an amazing job. So let's hear it for Truman. And in the election, he really did a big victory over Dewey. He got 303 electoral votes to Dewey's 189. Truman won 49.6% of the popular vote compared to Dewey's 45.1. While the other candidates hardly got any of the vote. And he won Trump's surprise victory, was the 5th consecutive presidential win for the Democratic Party, the longest win streak for either party since the 1880 election. And with simultaneous success in the 1948 congressional elections, the Democrats retained control of Congress. And arguably, Truman would still be, would have won, well, he was going to run against Eisenhower, so he would have lost because Eisenhower was the most popular president imaginable. So no one was going to beat Eisenhower. So in a way, he was lucky not to run against him. But Truman did a great job. There's the electoral map. There's a paper that was printed earlier. It was a printer strike, and they wanted to get the paper out early. So the headline is Dewey defeats Truman, but of course he didn't. So anyway, I want to leave time at the end. So that's it for me. So that's my email if you want to do any more contacts. So do we have any questions from the group, from the peanut gallery, as they say?
Let's see. So that was, first I want to say that was a great talk, Martin. A lot of
Thank you.
information. Hopefully we get some more questions in. We got the first one right here. Did Eleanor Roosevelt support Truman?
I thought she did, but I would have to check. I mean, she supported him in the terms of when her husband died. She said, Truman said, you know, really condolences. She said, no, I really should give you condolences. I'm your president. So yes, I think she did.
All right. If anybody else has any questions, please submit them in the Q&A function or in the chat bar. Both those can be found in the Zoom, the tool function there. You should be able to submit those. But let's see. I will say also, I didn't say beforehand because I didn't want to influence anything, but I am actually a descendant of John Adams and John Quincy Adams.
Wow, good for you.
Yeah, almost directly, which is funny enough. But
yeah, wow, bravo.
Not offended by any harsh words spoken about any of them.
Okay.
Let's see. Who ran the most times for U.S. president?
FDR.
FDR.
4 times.
4 times.
Yeah, he ran 4 times, and he won 4 times with different vice presidents. Yeah.
That's a good track record.
Well, it's such a good track record. They passed the constitutional amendment saying you could only run 2 times.
Yeah. All right. Well, unless anybody else has any other questions, we could end it there. I mean, this was a really informative talk. I was trying to think of questions myself, but I mean, you really covered a lot of the bases.
Well, thank you. By the way, just say one thing. I mean, history is important. Young people today, I don't think, study history enough. So if you have children, grandchildren, you know, in school, one of the great ways to learn history, you know, instead of just memorizing facts and dates and blah, blah, is to learn it through biography. And so, because people like stories. So if you learn it through, like, you know, who are the presidents, you read the presidential biographies, much more interesting than just dry history. So, you know, try to get the kids interested in the presidents. It's a great way to learn history, and it's just also makes you calmer about today. Like, people are freaking out, oh, Trump is going to do all these terrible things, and it's going to be such a horrible election. Like, there were worse elections. I mean, if you look back, and also they talk about now the Civil War, we're going to have a Civil War. Okay, but we had a Civil War actually in the 1860s, and over 600,000 people were killed. We're not going to have that kind of Civil War. So, you know, it's mostly a war of words. Look, people do get killed, unfortunately. But I mean, the country's had way worse times. And even the protests, you know, I look at the protests on TV and people say, oh, these terrible protests, it's just a horrible thing. Yeah, but if you live through the 1960s, they were burning down cities in protests, and way more protests. And the 60s were way more chaotic than what's going on now. So history gives you a sense of balance so you don't freak out about what's happening now. So I'll leave you those with the last words unless anyone has any questions.
Yeah, actually, as you were talking, we had another question come in.
Good.
So they were asking, were there any primaries at the time, since Teddy Roosevelt seems to have lost in the general because he was running against other Democrats?
Yeah, there were primaries, but they weren't selected by the people. There were state legislatures that were just selecting the candidates. They didn't bother, you know, consulting the people. arguably this Italy isn't a direct democracy. It's not like Athens where each person has a vote and it's a direct vote. So if your representative is casting your vote, so in state legislatures, theoretically, they're casting your vote because you voted for the people in the state legislature. So yeah, there were primaries, but the actual voters didn't directly vote in the primaries. And they were basically, deals that were brokered. And, you can argue that was just as good as what's happening now, although maybe yes, maybe no. But anyway, no, they were primaries. And in that election of 1912, they really made an unfortunate choice because had they voted for Roosevelt, he would have easily defeated Wilson. And but that they felt Taft should get the nod, and he did. Yeah.
Somebody else asked that. They said that you said you were in favor of abolishing the Electoral College. What alternative would you propose?
Well, you just have direct voting. So in the Electoral College, what happens is each state, has a certain number of electoral votes, and they cast their votes. So in the Electoral College, you can, again, we saw, with Trump, with so many others, like with Trump and Hillary, and 5 other elections, the person who loses the popular vote can become president because he gets the electoral vote. So if you get rid of the electoral vote and just do the popular vote, whoever wins the popular vote, straight up. So if I get 40 million votes, you get 39 million votes, I win. Now, the argument against that is, mostly the Democrats want to do this because there are probably more popular votes for Democrats. That's the way it's been. The Republicans haven't really gotten more of the popular vote. And the Republicans want to keep the Electoral College because it's a way that the minority, in the sense of popular vote, can win. But so I would argue, at this point, I can understand the Founding Fathers. And by the way, with the Founding Fathers, with the Electoral College back then, just to let you know, so back then, the only eligible voters with Washington were white men of property. So what percentage of the nation was white men with property, the eligible voters? 6%. So Washington basically won with 6% eligible voters voting for him. It's ridiculous. So today, the vote's opened up, so anyone can vote. And then there's an argument, well, maybe we shouldn't make it so easy to vote. It shows if you make it harder to vote, people will, think more of the whole voting process. I don't know. I think, if you want to vote, you should vote. I think when you, Motor Vehicle Bureau, you register with a car, you vote. And they give you the right to vote. In some countries, they make you vote. In Australia, if you don't vote, they fine you. So it's mandated. I don't know if we should go that way, but it would help, the turnout. And so I'm in favor of getting rid of the Electoral College, but you can make the other argument about keeping it. I could make that argument, but I won't.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you about the Electoral College, where it just sort of makes sense to me. If you want to see who won, who got the most, it seems like the best bet. But it's definitely a bigger conversation, maybe a whole lecture in of itself to really dissect all the things around that.
Yeah.
And we had somebody else asking, what do you think of George Vidal's book, 1876?
Well, it's Gore Vidal.
Sorry.
I think anything Gore Vidal writes is great, but it's a combination of fact and fiction. Vidal was a wonderful, wonderful writer. So some crazy books like Myra Breckinridge, but his historical writing is good. And 1876 was great. I mean, that was an important election in 1876, one of the most important because it ended Reconstruction, which was really gave the South kind of won the Civil War when Reconstruction ended because they could do whatever they wanted. So yeah, it was a very good book. Highly recommend anything by Gore Vidal. I recommend.
And the last question that we have here so far, do you think that the Republican Party will reframe themselves post-Trump in an effort to prevent him from possibly being the front runner again in 4 years?
Well, because it's my opinion. Obviously, I'm not the super expert. And by the way, there were no really super experts. No one knows. This isn't like chemistry or math. I mean, people are guessing. No, I think the Republican Party will have to be very much like Trump because basically the base loves Trump. And the base is a lot of people. I mean, Trump lost the election with like 70 odd million votes. I mean, wow, all these people voting for Trump. What's that about? And basically, it's about they like Trump for various reasons. I mean, for cultural reasons. He's pro-life. Trump would have been pro-life or pro-choice. Trump to me is a transactionalist, so he wanted to win. He's people think Trump. They compared him to dictators who have real policy ideas. Like Hitler was a guy who had real. I mean, it's not good to compare people to Hitler, but Hitler was a guy who really had a vision for what he wanted. To me, Trump didn't have a real vision for the country, he had a vision for himself. But people seem to like a lot of Trump's policies. He was good on taxes for many Republicans who like that. Obviously, for the Supreme Court, he would very good for Republicans. Pro-life, very good. Pro-gun, very good. In terms of race relations, the South, there are many races in the South, and I don't know that Trump was a racist, although I argue he is, because he was the one that came up with the birther thing, or really advanced it. And even the Central Park Five, those guys in New York who were accused of murdering the jogger, when the DNA test showed that they were innocent, he kept pushing it. So, I mean, and there are a number of racists in the nation who hated Obama, who were allied with Trump. They like his chutzpah, that's a Yiddish word for bravado. They like the style. He's like in your face kind of guy. I don't know. I think the Republicans better be careful because Trump could run again. And he said he will run again. I think on Inauguration Day, he's going to say he's forming a committee to run again. That would be my prediction. Whether he will run again, I don't know. I don't know how much he really wants the job again. He can do, I think, just as well having his own, TV show and TV network, and he can rally people that way. And it'll be a tremendous force because there's so many in the base that support him. So whoever he supports has a good chance of winning. So the Republican Party now, I think, is pretty much stuck with Trump, or maybe they like it that way. I don't know. But anyway, it'll be an interesting dynamic. But I don't see how the Republican Party can reform that much because the base is for Trump. So where are you going to get the voters who want to go along with your reform? I don't see it.
Yeah, it's a tricky conundrum for any Republicans out there, and anybody working in the Republican Party to figure out what they want to do next. But I mean, if this current election doesn't fit into be the seventh of the strangest elections, I'm sure maybe 2024 definitely might fit that bill when we get there.
Yeah.
But that looks like all the questions we have for today.
Okay.
I want to thank you again, Martin, for joining us for this talk. And I want to thank everybody else for watching and enjoying this talk, and hopefully you sign up for some of our next ones. Go to southamptonhistory.org/calendar to see everything we have going on next. And have a good day, everybody.
Appreciate your attendance, everybody. I can't see you, but thanks for coming and thanks for the opportunity. Take care.
Bye, everybody.